Okay, we're nearly ready to start. This is the Free University of Brighton. This is a philosophy class at the Free University of Brighton. We are now trying to run them online with obviously the COVID crisis. I'm sure you're aware of that. If you want to ask a question in Twitch chat during the lecture, then you'll have to follow the channel. You don't have to ask questions in the Twitch lecture, in the Twitch chat. If you're from the Free University of Brighton, there is a Zoom call, a Zoom seminar at 8 o'clock, which your link to which is in River. If you're from the Free University of Brighton, you're probably familiar with River. If you're using Twitch, then we will be taking breaks during the lecture. It's sometimes a good idea to refresh the page you're watching Twitch on, particularly if voice goes out of sync. That can sometimes happen, and it's useful to just refresh the page that you're on, and it can sometimes fix that problem. Well, hopefully always it will fix that problem. I'll try and pay attention to chat while I'm talking, but obviously I'm not going to be focused on that. So similarly, if you're joining the Zoom call early, I will try and let people in at various points, particularly when I'm taking a break, but I'm not going to be focused on that. So that's primarily what's going to be happening. So if you're not familiar with this kind of space, I'm fairly new to it as well. But if you're not familiar with this kind of space, then just don't panic. Take a little while. We don't, over 10 weeks. You'll be familiar with it relatively quickly, I expect. They're all relatively straightforward. Right. So today's lecture is going to try and introduce existentialism as a philosophical school, as a problem area that enables us to think through certain questions, and in particular as a sort of set of philosophers and a set of ideas that are often much more directly connected to our everyday lives, the way in which we live, the way in which we find meaning in life, and seems appropriate during this particularly strange time, and to look back at some of the philosophers who directly address our existence. And obviously we're living in a time of a particular kind of existence at the moment under the crisis of COVID-19, and that particular crisis produces a new kind of framework for our existence. It gives us pause for thought, and so it's useful at this point perhaps to look at some of the existentialists and how they've enabled us to think, in particular how they've enabled us to think about our own lives. So this first lecture is going to primarily deal with some relatively basic concepts and explore what the problem is that existentialism wants to sort of enable us to think through. So we're going to look at subjects and objects, we're going to look at universals and singulars, and we're going to try and consider the question of existence in relationship to those things. There will be 2 breaks during the lecture, which I advise you to use. Take a moment, have a breather, go and have a wee, do what you need to do, but more importantly, stretch your body out from sitting down wherever it is and try and allow it to sort of have a little bit of space so you don't just get cramped, fall asleep and all that kind of stuff, because obviously sitting and listening in these kind of spaces can be quite tiring sometimes, quite difficult, and so you have to give yourself that chance. As I say, there will be a couple of breaks, but we're going to be looking at, as I say, subjects and objects, universals and singulars, and the question of existence. So some basic concepts, as I say. I'll try not to speak too quickly. It's a problem that people reproach me with, I suppose. I'll try not to speak too quickly, but let's start from some basic concepts. These 2 sort of pairs of concepts, subject and object and singular and universal, are kind of crucial for understanding existentialism. The subject and object probably is going to be the easiest one in some ways to deal with, but there's also something very important about this relationship to the singular and the universal. Sometimes that's encountered, that kind of distinction between the singular and the universal is encountered in use of the notion of particular and general, and we'll have a look at that. So what I want to first of all sort of address is the way in which existentialism offers us what I'm going to be later calling an alternative kind of reason. It offers us a different way of thinking and reasoning than we standardly encounter in everyday life, than we standardly encounter in something like the sciences, or that we standardly encounter often inside a lot of mainstream philosophy even. So it offers us a slightly different form of use of the concepts subject and object from what we might think of as a standard form of use. Now that standard form of use is a very broad category, and it's not necessarily that useful, but the distinction between this standard form and the existentialist form is simply the one I'm trying to draw upon. So I'm using very broad brushstrokes here, so bear that in mind. But in this standard form of use, what we encounter is this thing that we can sometimes call objective reason. It's focused on objects, or it takes things to be objects, and so if it's reasoning about the world around us, then it particularly focuses on the objects it's dealing with, and it kind of, I notice there's this thing sticking over my let's just get rid of that. Then it kind of deals with what we think of as the way things are for everybody. So objective in a sense means the way things are for everybody. The objects are encountered by various different people in various different ways, looked at, analysed, argued about, thought about, but the way in which reason operates is in some sense impersonal. It's for everybody. And this is one of the ways in which it connects to the idea of being universal. It offers us a universal account. Objective reason offers us a universal account of the way in which things are. Now, within this standard form of reason, you kind of distinguish between objective reason, which is a kind of valid reasoning, and opinion. The stuff that we all have in our heads, that we all think about, the world outside. We all have a sort of series of those beliefs, statements, propositions, often without any particular reason for them. They've kind of been acquired through habit, or someone has overheard something, or something stuck in their head that someone else said. Let's just get rid of that for you. So in that kind of situation, opinion doesn't hold any objectivity, doesn't hold as a reason. And so if you have an opinion about something, that's absolutely great, but if you want to have a reason as to why you believe something, then you're going to need to develop objective reasons. This is the standard form of a way in which we, as it were, might approach reason. Now, that distinction between the valid reasons and, as it were, opinions that are outside of validity, that aren't really invalid, but they're not capable of being placed into validity relationships. In other words, from your opinion, you cannot infer something true or false. Whereas in an organised argument with reasons, then moving from one step of the reason to the next can enable us to sort of get to a conclusion. Whether thought is subjective or objective is something that we're going to maybe have to explore in relationship to existentialism. The quick and easy answer is in a sense, existentialists are going to try and argue that it's both, and it has to be both. Whereas quite often in traditional, what I'm calling the standard form of use, the subjective is always going to be removed as a kind of impurity. So your opinions, your sort of biases, we might say, are always going to want to be removed. So you, as an individual, your subjective account of things is going to often want to be sort of purified out inside the standard form of reason, whereas in existentialism, it's going to have to be integrated. And so in the existential form of reason, what we find is this emphasis on what they call making reason concrete. Bringing it down from the abstract, and this relationship to abstraction and concreteness is very important for the existentialist. For them, philosophy and reason and thinking are not activities that we engage in just for abstract, idle pleasure. They are kind of absolutely crucial forms in which we encounter the world, and more importantly, in ways in which we encounter ourselves. And so they want to turn, when they say make reason concrete, quite often what this means is actually bringing it back to the person, bringing it back to what we will call the singular subject. Now, the subject is a category of philosophy. Anyone who says I, anyone who's able to say I in some sense can be placed under that category, so they are called a subject. And yet in that description of someone who can say I, that relationship to you as an individual, that specific subject that you are, is kind of removed from the sort of situation. Whereas existentialism is going to want to bring that back in all the time. It's going to want to be focused very much on what you as an individual subject, as a singular subject, not a universal subject, not the general category, but as a singular sort of specific concrete subject, how you encounter and think through the world. And that relationship between subject and object and singular and universal is kind of brought together quite often in Kierkegaard's work. We'll find this to be the case. That obviously used to be something we have to discuss as we look at Kierkegaard more specifically. But Sartre calls Kierkegaard's attempts to articulate, to think, and to express himself as attempts to express what he calls the singular universal. So this is this idea that the subject here, the singular, is at the same time the truth of the subject in a more universal sense. So our particular existence also implies something about existence more generally. The other element that existentialism is going to focus on very, very heavily is the idea that value and validity, which in the standard form of reason, standard form of use of reason, standard form of these categories, is associated with objective reason. For existentialists, value and validity are created. They are something that is brought forth from the position of the subject, which is primarily also, of course, so far a kind of human position. And in doing so, they construct, in producing values, in creating values, we construct what's sometimes called the normative realm, or the space of reasons, which is distinct from the natural realm. So in the normative realm, reasons can become, as it were, something like a cause, whereas in the natural realm, reasons obviously are not really causes in the same traditional way in which we understand causes. And so there are different realms here. It's important to notice this. There are kind of different realms that are going to be thought about. So it's not that existentialism is trying to give us an alternative form of reason to deal with the natural world. That's not its major concern, unlike some philosophies which are particularly interested in things within the natural world. Existentialism is far more interested in this kind of normative realm, in this realm of values, and this space of reasons, and the way in which that's going to operate, and the way in which subjects are going to be part of that and create that realm. Now, sometimes this normative realm is thought to be the same as the realm of ethics and morality. It includes that. It includes that area, but it's not reducible to that area. So there is more in the normative realm than just questions of the good and the bad. There are any value judgments, in a sense, are kind of coordinated inside that normative realm. Now, there are two relationships that we're talking about there, these subject-object relations and the other relations of singular and the universal. So let's quickly have a look at those two relations in a bit more detail before we take our first break. So in subject-object relations, one of the things we're concerned with primarily are points of view. Let's just bring this up. So all sorts of things are going to occur in relationship to objects, so in the relationship that subjects have to objects. And we're going to be able to describe these in lots of different ways depending upon lots of different situations and contexts. And so these I've described as intensities of unity and separation, relationships between the knower, the subject, and the known, the object. And so what do we mean by things like intensities of unity and separation? So in a sense, things like telescopes and optics, technologies, if you like, express variable intensities of being able to be seen. So something that you can now only see through microscopes has gone from a position of being unable to be seen to be able to be seen. And technology has a huge impact here in enabling us to alter and transform our relationships as a subject to objects. It alters the kind of ways of being, in a way, that we can sort of delineate in relationship to the world. So it alters all those different sort of ways, and it can have a very, very big impact on the ways in which, as it should be obvious, a way in which a subject relates to an object. Some objects, as it were, come into being only after technology has enabled them to be encountered properly. We also, when we look at subject-object relations, might encounter notions like feedback loops, thresholds and limits in describing these relations. And there's a whole series of ways in which we might want to sort of entangle the subject in the object, or the object in the subject. But within existentialism, one of the ones that's crucial, and this I think is something that's broadly speaking within philosophy as well, but it's very, very important within existentialism. The relationship between the thinker and the thought, the relationship between the philosopher and what it is they're trying to think about, the thinker and what it is they're trying to think about. These relationships are inherently not just relationships that are, as it were, one way, mediated by some sort of technology, perhaps mediated by ways in which that can be organized, but they're not primarily one way. They're not sort of subjects looking at objects. There are, for the existentialists, self-relations in the sense in which the way in which we look at the world, the way in which we exist in the world, through our looking, through our perceiving, through the objects that we kind of find in the world, these are ways of being and ways of doing. They are forms of life for the existentialist. And what we encounter as a thinker, or as a philosopher, or as someone engaging in existentialist activity, is we encounter ourselves in the relationship. And that kind of encountering of yourself in the relationship is one of the things that existentialism really, really focuses on, and it's perhaps crucial to Kierkegaard as well, to understanding what's going on with Kierkegaard. One of the things that we're going to encounter when we look at Kierkegaard's work is that he doesn't write under his own name very often. He uses lots of different pseudonyms, and we're going to encounter this thing that I'll mention later in the lecture called indirect communication. And the way in which we begin to understand the world tells us as much about ourselves as it does about the world. And this is a kind of key thing that existentialism continuously explores. It also sort of has quite commonly an idea that at the heart of that self-relationship of the subject to the object, at the heart of that relationship in everyday life, as it were, before existentialism has begun to have something to say about it, at the heart of that relationship, existentialists often think there's a kind of attempt to escape. There's an attempt, Sartre calls this bad faith, Camus calls it something like eluding, but there's often this attempt to escape, in a way, to not be able to face up to the reality. That seems to be the thing existentialists often say about our relationship to the world, is that we're not generally able to face up to reality. And so when we look at subject-object relations, one of the things we're often doing when we look through existentialist work is encountering those things I'm trying to avoid, encountering the ways in which I try and escape from some of the conclusions that might be necessary. And one of the ways in which I want to try and think about that during the course is by us articulating it with this question: how do I find myself in my knowledge? This is an attempt to sort of try and sort of articulate this self-relation of the thinker to thought. What's, for example, a good way of dealing with the side effects of thinking about subject-object relations? Like side effects such as overthinking, unintended consequences, social disruption by being an irritating little philosophy student. Those kind of things are going to be important. Those kind of things, how do we deal with those unintended consequences? They're going to kind of be practically important. But there's perhaps a more troubling worry, one that Kant, for example, had when he had this fantastic notion of what he called the Transcendental Illusion, that there's an inevitable blind spot inside our thinking, that the way in which the subject relates to the object hides something and covers something up. And one of the things we might want to say that existentialists kind of sort of bring to the fore, in a sense, they don't strictly articulate this, but they give the conditions for it, is that with existentialism, at least with Kierkegaard onwards, thinking begins to be suspicious of itself. It's not completely transformatively clear. It's not an innocent relationship, and this relationship to thinking, where the thinker begins to become suspicious of the thinking process, of what it is that what it is we're missing, what unintended consequences we might be missing, what inevitable blind spots there might be. As we begin to be suspicious of thought, as we begin to kind of just be a little bit cautious, one of the things we begin to do is learn about the way in which we are doing the thinking and the problems that we might be bringing to this. The second of our relationships, the singular and the universal, which I've said sometimes is found in particular and general talk, which is perhaps more common, perhaps more empirical, and the particular and the general with the example is probably most easiest found inside cases and the laws that are generated and generalized from those cases. So that is a way in which the particular and the general is related. And in a sense, the singular is related to the universal in some sense, in an analogous way. There's a kind of a concept which is a universal that singulars are made part of. They're part of the set that is that concept that are brought. So there's a concept of cat, and then there are singular cats that are brought into under that concept, and we can identify them as cats. It's not the same as the particular general relationship to laws, but that relationship between a specific concrete or singular or particular moment and the way it's brought under a concept, i.e. identified or described, or brought under a law as a moment in a particular lawful activity. Those are kind of relationships between these particulars, these singulars, and these universals or these generals. Now, in Kantian and post-Kantian philosophy, which existentialism is definitely sort of located inside that particular framework, it's part of a Kantian and post-Kantian world, and that can include Hegel. The singular and the universal, they form part of a generalized concern with limits, and these are often tied up with concerns about language, and we encounter those notions of limits obviously most clearly in Kant. In his three critiques, he's looking at limits of thought, limits of thinking, limits of reason, understanding, intuition. But and in Hegel, we're looking also at limits in terms of the extent of the infinite, in particular the infinite understanding. But one of the things we're also encountering in that particular moment in philosophy is this concern that we encounter with Kant, for example, with notions of self-regulation. Now, for Kant, self-regulation is a sign of kind of maturity. We begin to act reasonably. We begin to obey the law of reason, but without taking reason to be somehow an absolute that can give us everything. We need to find the limits in which it can be used. And with someone like Hegel, the notion of limit is transformed into or transferred to the relationship between the individual as a singular in relationship to society as a universal. And in particular for Hegel, society becomes a kind of rational universal. Now that last moment of self-regulation and the relationship between the individual and society is again going to be very important for Kierkegaard. It's going to be one of the backgrounds to what he calls, and the concept we're going to encounter, called the teleological suspension of the ethical. It's a very strange concept, the teleological suspension of the ethical. But that's going to be directly related to this notion of self-regulation. And again, there's this relationship between the knower and the known. How is it I'm meant to behave when I know something? How am I meant to take what I know and act upon it? Do I just blindly act upon stuff that comes out of arguments? Do I have some other sort of way of moderating or dealing with the way in which I'm going to act? Issues of self-regulation are also very important to existentialism, but in a very different way from either Kant or Hegel. And in this situation, I want to just suggest we can use this question: how do I find myself in relationship to reason? How am I in relationship to reason? How am I operating? How am I behaving? Now, you can have two different kind of answers here. One is reason is my master and it tells me what to do. The other would be reason is my slave and I tell it what to do. So, in a sense, the first is I give up all power, and the second is I transform reason into just a tool. So I maybe make a good argument or a good case for something, but whether I should, do the thing in the end is kind of irrelevant. I've already decided upon that, and I'm just using reason to sort of explain or give an excuse for, or enable me to get away with doing something. And in that situation, reason is my slave. It's not really reason there, it's just a kind of form of argument. But in the former case, where reason is my master and I behave reasonably, and I want to behave reasonably, where those kind of things are kind of crucial and important to me, to what extent do I obey reason? To the extent that it's my master, I would be in a relationship of what we call heteronomy. So where the law is, as it were, given to me from outside. And what's important about that strange word is it's the opposite of autonomy. Now, the existentialist question here often concerns these concepts of heteronomy and autonomy because it explores autonomy in the face of reason. And this is kind of important. Most of the problems existentialists raise come from taking reason seriously. Okay, they don't come from ignoring it or trying to remove it or try and destroy it or somehow put it aside. They come from taking reason seriously. They come from using it and giving it a degree of power over us, heteronomy, but without ever impinging, as it were, upon our autonomy. And the questions here are kind of like things like, can a rational person be autonomous? Or, more problematically, can you be autonomous without being rational? But what are the limits of that autonomy? Now, there is some criticism that can be made of existentialism here, and one of the criticisms perhaps most commonly made is that it's relatively naive and it presupposes a subject and it's extremely humanistic. It doesn't really, encounter the world outside of the way in which humans encounter it. Some of those criticisms may be accurate, but there's also another criticism, which is that existentialism is fundamentally sentimental, and it has just too much interest in sentiment, and there is a kind of notion here that I would like to use when we think about existentialism, and it's massively reductive, and it should only be used with extreme caution. But one of the things we can think about is does existentialism really simply offer us an idea that we need to use our heart as well as our head? Is that really all it boils down to? If it does boil down to what we can obviously in some sense call a truism, head or heart or head and heart, the question would become something like, how on earth are we meant to actually articulate the heart with the head? How in relationship to reason do we not just simply end up either being rational or being sentimental, either being head or being heart? Is there a way in which these two can be articulated coherently? I think that's probably what existentialism enables us to begin to think through most clearly. And we'll take a break there. Just going to check my other bits and pieces, my zooms and rivers while I'm in a break. If you need anything there, give us a shout. Oh, right. I wonder what we're doing. It's very strange, this kind of online class format, because I'm so used to teaching in a live setting with people around, and we're all kind of in this room together, and all the kind of bodily interactions that occur in that kind of space, that it's very odd to be trying to do it online. But it's, I suppose, an interesting experiment. We'll see how well it works. But let's return to our existentialism. Just going to put a marker on. All right, so the second part of our lecture. What's the problem? It's always a good idea when dealing with philosophy, when looking at particular philosophers, to try and work out what their problem is. And by that I don't mean, what's your problem, in some sort of aggressive way in which we're kind of like challenging someone. What I mean is, what is it that's motivating and organising the philosopher's work? Now, in a specific individual philosopher, it can obviously vary during the course of their work, but quite often there's a sort of dominant theme that can be kind of addressed. So for some philosophers it might be the problem of life, other philosophers it might be the problem of consciousness, or truth, or relations between truth and life, or all sorts of things. But it's slightly different when it's a school of philosophy. And existentialism is a particularly kind of strange school. I think Jaspers says that there's not really a use of the term existentialism until something like the mid-1920s. And existentialism becomes a very, very powerful school of thought, sort of late 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s maybe, after which it's sort of put on the sidelines. But for a long time, it's a very, very powerful form of philosophy. It's a very big school of philosophy. And when we're looking at a school of philosophy, then when we ask what's the problem, it's a little bit more difficult, because obviously a school of philosophy has a much broader set of characteristics. It's got a big wide membership quite often, and so each person may be approaching it, each person may be organising their work around a different kind of problem, and they may be using a similar methodology, for example, but not sharing the same problem. But with existentialism, I think there is a problem that they kind of all share. And the problem they have fundamentally is this relationship to rational systems. Rational answers. So rational systems, if we want to look at what the problem is with them, rational systems are seen to construct answers to the problem of meaning. Something we might describe as they produce generalizations or explanations of human behavior. So they produce these explanations that are explanations in general, or as a universal, to use that term earlier when we were talking about singulars and universals. So the explanation is at the level of the universal. It applies to, or it aims to apply to everything. Everything that it's going to, take account of. So explanations of the weather aren't just explanations of the weather over Britain; they're explanations of the weather on a global scale. Or explanations of money aren't explanations of money in a particular country necessarily, although they may break down to that. They're often explanations of money at a general scale. But when we look at things that are perhaps more intimate to us, what would be the explanation of love? Would it even work if it was just at this sort of general level? When people tell you that love is a kind of, sorry, I'm fiddling with my hands, I can see that. When people tell you that love is maybe the same as, the response you have in your brain to eating chocolate or something, that doesn't feel like, I would suggest, anything to do with the way in which you encounter that relationship, if you do. And if I was to give you a general psychological, or that's probably the easiest one at the moment, a rational explanation to love, let's say I'm going to tell you that it's part of the evolutionary process that's developed and is actually a disguised form of instinctive behaviour, or disguised form of adaptive behaviour, or disguised form of some sort of evolutionary dynamic, then I'm producing a nice rational answer to the meaning of love, but it's an answer at the universal level, and we're struggling when we encounter those answers to work out how I fit, how this does anything for me or to me. Do I simply just believe this? Do I change anything in my life on the basis of that? Presumably, believing something and having no impact is kind of a meaningless belief. And so what existentialism is doing is sort of responding to a lot of attempts by what we might say the rational objective reason, by saying something like, you're offering me a general answer, you're offering me a universal explanation, but I'm an individual, and the meaning that you're giving me must be a meaning that somehow is mine. It encounters me, that I have this relationship to it that I can call a relationship of ownness or belonging. And the difficulty the existentialists are going to say is that I can't get this relationship of owning the meaning, of having that meaning, by taking the meaning from outside, by taking the meaning from a position that I'm not in, by taking the meaning from the universal. And primarily the reason for this is because I am the one that's creating meaning. I am the source with meaning. I am not provided with a meaning by some rational explanation. I am the provider of meaning. And the rational explanation is something that I can encounter, but if I just give up my own relationship to meaning in favour of this rational universal explanation, then I'm still going to be unsatisfied. It's still going to be a kind of illusion. It's still going to be some perhaps escape from the way in which I exist in relationship to that answer. So let's pop this one up a bit full screen so you can see that. So to carry on with this, so existentialism, we can say, is an attempt to reduce the distance between the reason, or reason more generally, and the individual. And the way in which it wants to do this is it wants to not subsume the individual in the rational system. Now this is a strange word, subsuming. This is a kind of directly taken out of a relationship that someone like Kierkegaard has with Hegel. And this is important to kind of understand what's the problem. It's kind of important to understand that Kierkegaard is the starting point in many ways for existentialism, and his starting point, his problem, was Hegel, fundamentally, and his problem is probably easily paraphrased in a sense of saying, well, within Hegel's system, this is Kierkegaard, within Hegel's system, the individual is essentially completely subsumed. They are lost. This is what the subsuming means. They are completely lost. What is it that makes them an individual? That singularity of the individual, the singular of the subject. This is lost inside the individual. This is lost inside the rational system. They are subsumed completely inside the rational system. And so Hegel will explain, or Hegel's system will explain all the kind of ways in which we think, argue, the ways in which we encounter the world, as individuals. He'll explain those by placing us within the system. We'll have a particular role that we're playing out according to the way in which his system describes the roles of development of our ideas. And so the actual individual, the singular that we are ourselves, the one that says I, not in a sort of general sense, not in the universal, but in that singular sense, the one who says I, they are subsumed in this rational system. And this is Kierkegaard's kind of key starting point in relationship to Hegel, and it's the, as it were, key problem that motivates and continues to motivate what we call existentialist thinkers. And there are various ways, it's not just Hegel, there are various ways in which we can get these subsumptions, or we can encounter these subsumptions where the individual is, as it were, a bit lost in a broader rational system. So we can have ethical systems where you're subsumed. We can have things like the categorical imperative of Kant, for example, or the utilitarian's greatest good, or even Hegel's ethical evolution. And the individual is constantly kind of lost in the sense in which the system produces a series of identities that it then tells us that we are. So we are in this particular position. You are maybe in the position of being student or tutor or partner. But you're in a situation that the system kind of decides for you, and you don't really get any say over that. Obviously, the system is deciding for you. But more importantly, the way in which you respond is always going to feel wrong. So if you disagree with the system, you're constantly going to be in this kind of tension of like, well, the system says, let's say that it's the Kant's system of ethics, the categorical imperative. The system says this is how I should reason about what to do in the world, and that's great, and we can produce an answer. So we can. The categorical imperative says the only good act is an act that you can, as it were, universalize. So that in anyone in your situation would do the same, and this is kind of crucial. Anyone in your situation would do the same, and of course, what's lost in that situation is how you, specifically in that situation, would behave, because you're irrelevant for Kant in the categorical imperative. The rational system has got a way of producing an answer to what to do in a particular situation, and your particular response is kind of meant to be put aside. The objective reason give you the way in which you're meant to behave. And of course, what people find is that they have great difficulty coming into alignment with these rational systems. They have great difficulty in feeling like the rational system can actually give them any answers about how to do things, how to behave. Because they constantly feel like they're either in the wrong, or they can't agree or align with the system, or they don't understand how that answer is actually going to work, or quite often because the answers that the rational systems give, in which the individual is kind of lost, the answers just seem stupid, they just seem ridiculous, they seem abstract. And this is kind of the key problem that existentialists want to focus on. It's like by essentially saying, yes, they are. You've been subsumed into a rational system as an individual, the individual's been lost, and the rational system isn't going to be able to supply the answer that you're looking for. Right, what this produces, let's try and reason as objective. This is just, we're going to finish for another break in a short while. Reason as objective. And when we think of reason as objective, I mean, this is perhaps a bit polemical. So this is not true. This is definitely a kind of polemical rhetorical device. But when we think of reason as objective, think of a desert. There are no people there. There's nothing there. There's no life in reason that's objective. It's a desertification of the world. An existentialist wants to repopulate the world. He wants to enable that world full of life, full of vigor, full of variety that we live in, but more importantly for them, full of subjects that live in that world, of which we are key examples. He wants to enable that world to be repopulated again, to end the desert of the reason as objective. Okay, so I'm going to be taking a short break again there. Again, I suggest you stretch your legs, do something, even if it's just to sort of put your hands above your head and, there we go. Anyway, so let's take a break there for another 5 minutes. So I'll start just before 10 to, like the last 12 minutes of the lecture. For those students that are here from FUB and want to join the seminar, the Zoom link is up on River, along with the password, and you probably can actually join up now if you want. I'll start the room up, make sure it's there. So yeah, if you want to join then you will. I'll keep an eye on that if you want to check your bits and pieces. There is a way of doing song requests in the chat, I believe, but I must admit I haven't sorted that out yet. How that works. But yeah, you can. I think if I put on some mod or some activity in my stream, you can actually play songs through, the background. I'm not quite sure how that works. recommended. I will let you watch that on your own at some point when it's not yelling at me about zebra puke. That's quite right. Okay, let's continue. Right. So, as I mentioned at the start, we can kind of think of existentialism as a different form of the use of reason. So, a different form of the use of those concepts, subject and object, and singular and universal, a different form of use of those concepts as part of a different kind of way of reasoning. And when I say different, different from, as I say, what we might find either standardly in everyday use, or even inside widespread inside philosophy, inside things like science, etc. So there's an external model that we're calling the standard form of reason, objective reasoning, that existentialism wants to offer an alternative to, and it's very, very much focused on the subject, but in particular it's also focused on what we might call practical and doing focused relationship, or sometimes people might call this process focused or becoming focused. So this is a quote from Kierkegaard. It is commonly assumed that no art or skill is required in order to be subjective. To be sure, every human being is a bit of a subject, in a sense, but now to strive to become what one already is, who would take the pains to waste his time on such a task, involving the greatest imaginable degree of resignation? Quite so. But for this very reason alone, it is a very difficult task, the most difficult of all tasks, in fact, precisely because every human being has a strong and natural bent and passion to become something more and different. Now, there are lots of different things we can say about that particular little quote, one of which obviously is that he has a kind of essence. There's a little bit of a subject there, and there's these notions of like a natural bent, and there's an element in there that might seem a little bit contradictory, because one of the slogans, this comes from Sartre more than anything else, but one of the slogans of existentialism is existence before essence. So the way in which you exist is more important than what it is that you are. In fact, the way in which you exist, the existence, produces what it is you are. And this is an ongoing theme that's kind of crucial, and that is seen there in the way in which Kierkegaard is focusing on the production, the self-production that you need to engage in as a subject. And the ongoing theme of existentialists is and this again is this contrast of methods, is the emphasis on poiesis. What's called poiesis is a Greek word, which essentially means something like making, but obviously is strongly related to things like poetry. Poiesis, as opposed to, or versus, or distinct from, because we don't always have to be in opposition with or in conflict with, but poiesis versus noesis, which again is a Greek word that means roughly intellect, or what we might call cognition. And the question that all existentialists want to kind of address, and this is why in some ways it's a very intimate philosophy, one that's very capable of offering answers to us, is it wants to ask how do we make ourselves a subject. It doesn't want to ask what we are as a subject. It wants to develop ideas around how we can actually make ourselves into a subject. And Kierkegaard in particular, although I think again this is more broad inside existentialism, they argue in a sense that one of the key ways in which we're going to become a subject, one of the key ways in which we're going to address the how do we become a subject rather than what is a subject, is through taking something to heart, learning by heart. And again, this role of the heart as a kind of metaphor for our inner self, our soul, our subjectivity, our I-hood, we might say, or that which is mine. But this notion of the heart here is a metaphor for that which is the core of the subject, the core of ourselves, that which I most think of as mine. And so how do I bring what's external, what's a reason, what's outside of me, in particular the relationship to truth perhaps, how do I bring that inside? How do I become part of that relationship in such a way that I can move towards greater autonomy, being a subject? Now, one of the reasons of thinking about it, this is a sort of an example to think about, is that there's something incredibly important about the singularity of poetry. And this, in a sense, can stand as a kind of metaphor for the way in which the individual or the subject should be taken inside existentialism. So a line of poetry or a poem, when it expresses whatever it is expressing about, whatever it's talking about, when it does its work, when it tells its truth, it's a completely singular relationship to the world around. And the way in which we can tell this is that we can translate poetry. It can be very difficult. It can sometimes be pointless. But it's impossible to paraphrase poetry without destroying the poem. The poem itself is a singular construction that has to be taken seriously in order for us to understand what it is. We can't simply paraphrase poems and then have a relationship to that poem. There's something very, very singular about the poem itself, the way in which those particular words operate, the rhythms, the rhymes, the constructions, that is crucial to the singularity of that poem. And so in that sense, a subject is much more like a poem than a car, for example. It's not a production, it's not an organised set of parts put together with a particular kind of core idea at its heart. A subject is much more closely connected in a sense to being a poem than it is to being an object. And for Kierkegaard, one of the ways in which we learn about subjectivity and take it to heart is through this process he calls reduplication. Reduplication is this lovely idea that the truth should not be taught as though it were direct and transparent, but rather in such a way that it enables you to hear that truth from yourself and to encounter that truth as something that you've taken up in your own singularity. Now, direct communication, which is what we communicate information with, and indirect communication are key kind of dividing lines inside Kierkegaard, very important things to understand when we begin to read Kierkegaard. And indirect communication is not about transmitting information. Indirect communication is this relationship to the heart learning. And indirect communication is the development of a capacity, in some sense a capacity to hear a particular call. So in the case of Kierkegaard, that's going to be the capacity to hear the call of faith, but it can also be more broadly the call of truth, or the call of autonomy. And that indirect communication is a way of enabling the capacity without telling us what to do, a way of enabling us to learn to be able to do it. Now, existentialism has these central concerns of making and process rather than fixed results, and this is absolutely crucial to understanding what they're trying to do. It may be not that you necessarily need to agree with them, but in terms of trying to understand what they're trying to do, this relationship to making and process are going to be absolutely fundamental. And so when we read, say, against Kierkegaard, what is the author, not particularly Kierkegaard, because he's not the author of Fear and Trembling, but what is the author of Fear and Trembling? What's the process that they're producing that we're engaging in as we're engaging with that text? What is it, that we're kind of being asked to join in with? And here, as I said, the heart as well as the head. So let's not put them into immediate conflict, but the heart as well as the head is going to be crucial. Transforming something out there into something in here is going to be, in a sense, the mode in which we encounter truth. That's going to be an absolutely primary concern, this process of making and using the heart as well as the head. But the second element of that is it's going to be concrete and not abstract. It's going to be, this is the word, existential. It's going to be about and intimate with our existence. It's going to deal with those things that we think of as, the closest to us. And it's important to remember that this is existentialism because it still involves a process of reason. It's philosophy because it still involves a process of reason. It still involves processes of argument and inference, conclusion. It still involves modes of debate and dialogue, and sometimes what we might call the dialectic. But the goal of the reasonings, the reason we are reasoning, if you're an existentialist, is not to just abstractly gather knowledge, but in order to produce a concrete possession of knowledge, to move from someone who doesn't know to someone who does know, but not in an abstract way, in a sense in which we've transformed ourselves in that process. And so the existentialist offers us a challenge in a sense, which is, if we're to take them seriously, we cannot read them abstractly. We have to try and encounter, when we read them, our responses, the way in which we feel about what they're saying, and to take those feelings as kind of primary starting points, not conclusions, but primary starting points for how we begin to respond, why that feeling is being brought forth, why that particular response is being brought forth, what other responses might I want to have instead, and how might I be able to get to a position of being able to have those kind of responses. Okay, so all of this is kind of, I've put these questions in the course of the lecture that I want to hang on to and leave out here. How do I find myself in my knowledge, and how do I find myself in relation to reason? These are going to be kind of, I think, hopefully methodological ways in which we can, approach the existentialist texts. I'm going to be finishing in a moment, and we'll be moving to a Zoom seminar for Free University of Brighton students, FUB students. If you've joined us on Twitch and you're not in FUB, but you live in Brighton, you're welcome to join FUB. You can find us through Facebook, or just find us through threeuniversitybrighton.org. And you're welcome to join FUB if you're around from Brighton. If you're not from Brighton, obviously you're more than welcome as well to come along to stream. And there's links down below in the Twitch page to Discords and stuff where you can make further contact if you want to. But for now, I'm going to leave you there, and I'll see the FUB students that want to on the seminar. Thanks very much, everyone.